Does violence beget violence? The cycle of violence theory is that violence breeds more violence and is passed down through generations and families. This week we will be reading an article by Kathy Wisdom, who studied the cycle of violence. The questions will be: does being raised in an abusive, negligent environment lessen the restraints for evil? Did this study simulate evil? And how could the information from this study be used to prevent evil? Is violence a learned behavior that children will wind up copying later in life? Does growing up in an abusive home lessen the restraints for evil doing? Wisdom examined whether children who were physically abused, neglected, or sexually abused went on to have criminal records as juveniles and adults. In past studies, the independent variable of abuse was not clearly defined. In this study, however, the author clearly defined what it meant to be abused, sexually abused, or neglected. Abuse is when a person knowingly and willingly inflicts unnecessary corporal punishment or unnecessary physical suffering upon a child or children. For example, striking, punching, kicking, biting, throwing, or burning. Sexual assault. A variety of charges ranging from non-specific charges of assault and battery with intent to gratify sexual desires to more specific, detailed charges such as fondling and touching in an obscene manner, sodomy, and incest. Neglect is cases where the child has no proper parent or guardian, is living in destitute conditions, and is not having their basic needs met, such as food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. The matched cohort design is what makes this study set apart from past studies. For every subject in the independent variable group of abuse, there was a control subject who was very similar in demographics other than the fact that they were abused. They were similar in age, often from the same town and elementary school. They were from the same economic class, same gender, same race. Everything was the same except for the independent variable of abuse to try and negate other variables contributing to later violence. The researchers went to one unnamed metropolitan area in the Midwest, and they got a sample of 908 children who were neglected and abused between the years 1967 and 1971, who were all 11 or younger at the time of their case records. What they did was they looked for children who were similar in demographics and tried to find a match for each child. Out of the 908 abused children, there were 667 matched cohorts, with a total number of 1,575 in their sample. Researchers looked for both juvenile and adult criminal records that took place after the abuse records. They chose to only have children 11 or younger to make sure that they had no prior criminal history to their abuse records, to make sure that it was the abuse that led to the violent behavior and not an ongoing pattern of violent behavior unrelated to the abuse. Data was collected from juvenile court, the probation department. Adult criminal histories were searched for at a local, state, and federal level for both the abused and control groups. This chart shows the percentage of participants with recorded offenses. 27% of the abused and neglected sample had some type of juvenile delinquency, while about 17% of the control group had juvenile delinquency. 28% had an arrest record as an adult, and 21% had an arrest record in the control group. There were less overall violent offenses, but there were still about 11 or 12% in the abused and neglected group, and only 8% in the control group. This chart shows the mean number of criminal arrests across both groups. In the abused and neglected group, the average number of criminal arrests, or the mean number of criminal arrests, was about 2.4 per person. In the control group, it was about 1.4, which is significantly less. This chart shows the average age of first criminal offense. It is significantly younger in the group of children who are abused and neglected, being at only 16.5 years old, while the non-abused cohorts had their first offense around 17.3 years old. This slide represents the percentage of chronic offenders, meaning having 5 or more offenses. In the abused and neglected group, 17% were chronic offenders. In the control group, 9% were chronic offenders. This chart shows all of the data from the study. It shows that among juvenile records, adult criminal records, and any type of violent criminal record, that the abused and neglected group had a much higher overall rate in each category. Males were more likely than females to have any type of juvenile, adult criminal, or violent record, and blacks were more likely than whites to have any type of juvenile, adult criminal, or violent record. Now, it is important to note that it is often the case that males and black people are more targeted by the police than white people and women, so this may very much also represent just who got caught more, not who committed the most crimes. This chart shows what demographics are the strongest predictors for violent crimes. The blue line represents what is significant. So anything below this line is not a significant predictor. As you can see, being male, being black, being older, being physically abused and neglected are all significant predictors of violent crimes, but interestingly, being male and black are the strongest predictors. But then again, is this really a behavioral predictor, or does it say more about our society and how the police targets people? The results show evidence that supports the hypothesis that child abuse and neglect can lead to violent behavior later in life. Abuse and neglect had a strong correlation with juvenile delinquencies, arrests, and violent offenses. Race, gender, and previous criminal behavior were independent variables that were also strongly correlated with these offenses. So, does being raised in an abusive and negligent environment lessen the restraints for evil? Well, we do know that more of the group that was neglected or abused wound up having a violent or criminal record compared to the control group. The large majority still did not have a record. So there is no evidence that neglect and abuse leads to evil, since it is more likely than not that they will have no record. So, did this study simulate evil? Well, I don't think so. Unlike the other studies in this class, there was no manipulated independent variable or experimental condition that could simulate evil. The study was purely correlational and observational. While violent offenses could very well indicate evil actions, it is not specific, and some violent offenses could have been done without the intent of causing harm. For example, maybe someone was just poor and desperate, and they had to use violence to get something they needed to survive, or maybe they got caught up in a fight and had to defend themselves and got charged with a crime, but they had no evil intent. We can't really know, since there were hundreds of people in this study, and I'm sure their violent records all had different stories behind them. So how can we use the information from this study to prevent evil? So the study obviously cannot prove that abuse and neglect are a direct cause of violent behavior. It shows that there is a decent correlation there, but also violent behavior relates to other variables such as poverty, class, race, and gender. The majority of abused and neglected children do grow up to be law-abiding citizens, as far as we know. Researchers should closely study abused children, both those who grow on to be criminals and those who do not, and see what causes some of those victims of abuse to turn to violence but not others. This information could then be implemented in early intervention programs. This study had several limitations. The biggest one is that there were many unreported cases of neglect. Abuse during this time, which means the sample may not have had huge external validity. It's also important to consider that we do not know for sure if the controls had unreported cases of abuse, and this means that there may have been a starker contrast between the two groups had the researchers known for sure that the controls had never been abused, both on or off legal records. Lower class families and ethnic minorities are often more targeted by social services and are more likely to have official records for abuse. Middle and upper class families often went underreported. Black men, for cultural and social reasons, often end up getting criminal records because they are targeted by the police, so it is hard to say how much this has to do with their past and having abuse and how much it has to do with the world we are living in. Legal process could have also had a damaging effect and been another variable in this study that would not have external validity to other abuse victims who were not part of the legal process. And they also did not look at abuse in the home, such as child abuse and spousal abuse that may have gone unreported. It only looked at criminal records and violent offenses. And it would be really interesting to see if child abuse ran in families. Lastly, they did not consider the other effects that child abuse and neglect may have, such as depression, suicide, and other psychiatric illnesses. Women and sexual abuse survivors may be less inclined towards violence and may take their own pain inwards on themselves. This study was not designed to observe all the impacts that abuse can have on children. Neglect and abuse are a difficult subject to study since most people try their best to keep it behind closed doors. So researchers have to either go off self-report data, which can be inaccurate and lies, or official records, which only shows a small portion of the picture and leaves out all the unreported cases. Physical child abuse is correlated with violent offenses later in life, but it seems to be just one piece of the puzzle. It is often a combination of variables that relate to being underprivileged and a target for the police that increase the likelihood that someone will end up with a violent criminal record. Some research needs to be done to understand how physical child abuse specifically relates to violent behavior, both in the public and domestic realms. This topic ties in well with the first week where we discussed whether or not consuming violent media leads to physical violence in children. It would have been interesting to do this the second week to compare the influence of fictional violence versus the very real violence some children have to grow up with.